Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republican virtual conversation. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Stephen Knott, professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Prior to accepting his position at the Naval War College, Dr. Knott was co-chair of the Presidential Oral History Program at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. His essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Post, Time, Politico, The Hill, Foreign Policy, and the National Interest. He is the author, editor of 10 books dealing with the American Presidency, the Early Republic, and American Foreign Policy. His most recent book, Coming to Terms with John F. Kennedy, was published by the University Press of Kansas in October 2022. Today, we're going to discuss his book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery, and the Prospects for Renewal. Dr. Knott, it's an honor to have you here today.
Well, thank you, JR. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and thank you for the important work that you are engaged in. We all need a little dose of the Constitution these days, and it's groups like yours, I think, that are in the vanguard of getting us back to our the basic principles of our constitutional republic.
Well, very, very thrilled about this book, and it was published in 2019, Doctor. And of course, a lot has occurred just in those 3 years. But I'd like to touch on the chronology that you have in the book, beginning with the introduction. And you say in the introduction that George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and other founders designed a presidency of, quote, sober expectations, close quote. Now, what were those sober expectations, Doctor, that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton had for the office of the president?
So I think, JR, that they wanted the president to be a unifying figure. They wanted the president to act with, as Hamilton and Washington put it quite frequently, act with dignity. They wanted the American president, I think, to act as a head of state. And I think that's part of what's been lost in the contemporary presidency. The more partisan and policy-making role has gone to the forefront. And those unifying gestures that a commander-in-chief is capable of making are sort of put in the back seat. So this constitutional presidency, or the presidency of George Washington, is, I would say, unrecognizable today. And I think we would all benefit from a return to that constitutional or Washingtonian presidency, which again emphasized unifying the public, acting with dignity, avoiding partisan entanglements, not firing up the base, but appealing to what unites all Americans. And I would add to that, appealing to the better angels of our natures, to borrow from Lincoln, yes, who admired Washington greatly, by the way. There's a conception of the presidency that existed for some time. I think it served us quite well. And unfortunately, we've lost that in modern times.
Make a great point, Doctor, in the book that the presidency, as Washington and Hamilton had designed it, was to be a protector of the minorities. And they were very, very cautious about the rule of the tyranny of the majority.
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, they put great emphasis, Washington and Hamilton did, on the president's Article 2 clause to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that may mean, and did mean at times, that the president might have to resist public opinion, resist popular passions, resist the majority tyranny that you mentioned. And you can see this, by the way, in Washington and Hamilton's decision to put down the Whiskey Rebellion of 1793-94. That, in the view of Washington and Hamilton, was an attempt by an armed minority to defy the rule of law. And that effort on the part of President Washington was controversial then, it's controversial now. But these men were committed to the notion of the rule of law. And no matter how just a particular cause might be, you cannot allow in a republic an armed group to defy the rule of law. So I think we've lost that sense. And as you mentioned, an important part of that concept of the importance of the rule of law was that it was put in place to protect unpopular minorities, whether they be racial or ethnic, religious, or economic. If you are out of step with the majority, that is you are putting yourself in harm's way, and our system of government was designed in such a way to keep that from happening. And the problem now with the more populist or popular presidency is that these individuals will throw in their lot with the majority at the expense of certain minority groups. That's not healthy in a republic.
And bringing down that whiskey rebellion, Doctor, you make mention of the fact that George Washington was leading, quote, the army of the Constitution, unquote, in doing that, which I think is a great description of what occurred in him bringing that down, that rebellion.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. And yes, Washington is the one who applied that label to that army, which, by the way, he led for a brief period of time. He actually marched with that army from the Capitol in Philadelphia to Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. And he did label it the Army of the Constitution. Now, it's important to point out there were dissenting views at the time, including from Thomas Jefferson, who referred to the Whiskey Rebellion as Hamilton's Rebellion. And Jefferson thought it was much ado about nothing. Jefferson was far more comfortable with the notion of majority rule. I think Hamilton and Washington were more wedded to the notion of the rule of law, and thus the difference of opinion over the correct response to this rebellion in Western Pennsylvania.
Chapter 2, Doctor, you introduce us to the Revolution of 1800. Now, what was the Revolution of 1800?
Well, Jefferson believed, he would later say, that the Revolution of 1800 was as important, or perhaps even more important, than the Revolution of 1776. And that's because Jefferson viewed the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams as being too British, in a sense, too almost monarchical. The Whiskey Rebellion being an instance, in Jefferson's view, of an excessive use of federal force. So for those reasons and many others, including Adams' unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts, and I would never defend Adams on that count, Jefferson believed that the Federalists had betrayed, as I said, the spirit of 1776, and his election of 1800, he was going to restore the principles of 1776, and part of that involved democratizing the presidency, in a sense. Jefferson puts far more emphasis on the idea that the president is a spokesperson for the majority, and that his power derives from the mandate he receives from the majority. Whereas Hamilton and Washington would have argued the president's real authority lies in the Article 2 powers given to him in the Constitution. So this was a significant change. 1800 is a significant change. And I think Jefferson opens the door to a more populist presidency that, again, I would argue, over time, has not served us particularly well.
So we see the first crack in the structure of the foundations of Article 2 in 1800. And Doctor, please elaborate how the original process of the Electoral College differed from what the founders intended and what Jeffersonians began to implement.
Yeah, so the original Electoral College, JR, was designed to allow the people to have a say, but the people's input into the selection of the president was filtered somewhat through this intermediate body known as the Electoral College. So you and I voting in our respective states back in 1788, the first presidential election, 1789, you and I would select state representatives who in turn would select electors, who in turn would select the president. And the feeling was at the time that most Americans, the average man on the street, and it was just men at this time, would not know the truly national characters. And it's also been said that only George Washington and Ben Franklin would have been recognized from Massachusetts in the north down to Georgia in the south. So the hope was that these electors, the best and the brightest from each of the original 13 states, would know who the national characters were, would know who those persons of integrity and of intellect capable to serve as head of state, they would select the president, not, again, the man on the street. Now, all of this changes with the passage of the 12th Amendment, which sort of recognizes the rise of political parties. Jefferson and his party pushed the 12th Amendment through in remarkably rapid time. And that action, along with the actions of various states, they're moving away from that more traditional selection of electors towards direct popular election of electors. It's going to take time, but it is all part of this broader democratization of the presidency.
And of course, the Federalists, as they were called, talked about the disadvantages of faction. And yes, originally, Washington wouldn't identify with himself with a party, neither would Hamilton, initially Madison. But of course, Jefferson comes along. And I've often thought, Doctor, how different would it have been if Thomas Jefferson was actually at Philadelphia in 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, in the deliberations, as opposed to being in France at the time and getting his correspondence with Madison on the news of the progress that was being made. How different would have things turned out if he was actually there, part of the deliberating process in formulating the Constitution?
Yeah, it could well have been quite different. I have mixed feelings about that. Being a good Hamiltonian, part of me is happy that Jefferson was in Paris. But on the other hand, perhaps had he been there during the deliberations, maybe that would have moderated or altered some of his views. But nonetheless, he was not there. And he did write to James Madison that he thought the job that the framers in Philadelphia had done was extremely impressive. He had a few qualms with the final document, one of which was the absence of term limits on the American presidency. Jefferson would have been pleased to see that we've now adopted the 22nd Amendment that limits a president to 2 terms. Jefferson thought something along those lines should have been included in the original Constitution. But he did think the framers, for the most part, had done a pretty good job. But it's when he comes back to the United States, when he serves in the administration of George Washington as our first Secretary of State, and he gets into these really knockdown, drag-out battles with Treasury Secretary Hamilton, that he begins to conclude that Hamilton, Washington, and of course John Adams are undertaking certain executive actions that are at odds with what the framers intended. And that leads again to this so-called Revolution of 1800.
And interestingly enough, Dr. Jefferson proposed the Constitution should be rewritten every 20 or so years. And in doing that, didn't he precipitate the ideas of progressivism that, of course, really TR starts and Woodrow Wilson began to personify as we move forward?
Yeah, I think so. That is certainly my take on affairs, on the course of American history. Jefferson believed, as he put it, that the dead should not govern the living, and that you and I should not be living in 2023 with portions of a Constitution written in 1787. And so Jefferson favored constitutional conventions, at least at the state level, every 20 years. Every generation should be able to rewrite its founding document, in a sense. Again, the dead should not govern the living. I believe in his heart of hearts, he extended that principle to national conventions as well. Hamilton argued that that type of constant change, every generation rewriting basic founding documents, would lead to instability, would lead to a lack of respect for the rule of law, because if you're altering your fundamental document every 20 years, you're indicating, or, there seems to be a sense there that you're not happy with a kind of stable legal system, that it's okay to uproot it constantly. Hamilton thought that was a prescription for disaster, for instability, and for a kind of contempt for the rule of law.
Of course, you touch on it in the book, Doctor, how the founders understood, or Washington and Hamilton understood, that human nature doesn't change. However, Jefferson, very much a Rousseauian, Jean-Jacques Rousseauian, of course, believed that human nature could be changed. And that had a lot to do with their philosophies of government, did it not?
It definitely did. And it's a nice point. Jefferson was very much taken with French or Swiss French political philosophy, Rousseau and others, but also a political philosopher by the name of Condorcet, who argued that mankind was kind of on this path towards a perfectibility of man, that human beings were improving over time. And of course, this is closely allied with Jefferson's faith in science, that scientific progress was teaching human beings to sort of break the shackles of religious superstition, as he believed it to be, and that there was this arc in human affairs that was leading us towards the promised land, towards a position of perfectibility. And you see that, by the way, in Jefferson's faith in the French Revolution. The revolutionaries were creating a new world order. And Jefferson was a big champion of it, even when it took a very bloody turn. Again, for Hamilton, this kind of utopian thinking, as Hamilton would have seen it, was ultimately dangerous, led to all sorts of human rights abuses, led to the bloodletting in France. So there was just two very different worldviews between Jefferson and the Jeffersonians and Hamilton and the Federalists. I think Hamilton had a more realistic view of human nature, Jefferson a more idealistic view. And, again, I tend to put myself in the Hamiltonian camp.
This is what I really appreciate about the book, Doctor, is the fact that you're describing Jeffersonian philosophy. We see the hints of progressivism that would later come about later on in the end of the 18th or the 19th century. But I want to move forward now to chapter 3, where we have one Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory. And he said in his first annual message to the Congress, he said, quote, "The majority is to rule," unquote. And how is that statement so very different than what Washington and Hamilton had envisioned for the presidency?
Yeah, so again, the Hamilton and Washington, I would say James Madison as well, who, by the way, lives long enough to see Jackson become president, and he's somewhat uncomfortable with that development, even though technically speaking, Jackson is an heir to the Jeffersonians and to the Democrat-Republican tradition. But Jefferson opens the door a bit to this notion of the majority being the source of executive power. Jackson kicks it wide open. Now, let me make this clear. Andrew Jackson is no Thomas Jefferson. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, for all my criticisms of him, was obviously an incredibly well-read man, a true Renaissance man. You cannot say that about Andrew Jackson. Right. But Jackson takes some of those Jeffersonian principles, as I said, kicks the door wide open, explicitly says, as you cited, on more than one occasion, that the majority is to govern. And again, for Madison, Hamilton, Washington, and most of the framers, the notion that the majority is to govern at all times, Jackson would add that as well, is directly contrary to their, I think, quite appropriate fear of the tyranny of the majority. And you do see during the Jacksonian era a fairly widespread effort to disenfranchise a particular unpopular minority. And I'm speaking about a fairly high number of free blacks living in the northern states, and actually in some southern states for a brief period of time. That is all going to be eroded during the so-called Age of Jackson. And again, it's all part of this notion that the majority, and we're talking here white males, should be the ones to govern. And these unpopular groups, be they free blacks, or I should add Native Americans, in the case of Andrew Jackson, these are people who are going to be pushed to the sideline. And that is a consequence of the Jacksonian principle that the majority is to govern, and it's completely disregarding the idea that the tyranny of the majority is arguably the worst form of tyranny of all.
Of course, later on, it would be called popular sovereignty with Stephen A. Douglas. And really, Doctor, that is the mentality of our political environment today. The majority must rule. But as we move forward, Doctor, please elaborate a little bit, if you will, on how Abraham Lincoln, our great mentor, how he embodied the sober expectations of the office anticipated by Washington and Hamilton.
Great. No, terrific question. And Lincoln sort of cuts his political teeth during the age of Jackson. And he's appalled by what he sees in Jacksonian America. Again, this tendency to oppress minority viewpoints. The murder of an abolitionist newspaper editor in Illinois shocks Lincoln to the core. So Lincoln rejects some aspects, I would say most of the aspects of the Jacksonian presidency, because for Abraham Lincoln, it's those founding documents. It's the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It's the articles in the American Constitution that one needs to revere, not the opinion of a contemporary majority. So the majority is not supposed to govern at all times. There are certain American principles that are off limits to a popular vote. And by the way, you mentioned popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas is an avowed Jacksonian. Andrew Jackson is Stephen Douglas's hero. And of course, Lincoln and Douglas are on opposite sides of this question as to what is the appropriate core principle of this American experiment. For Lincoln, it's those founding principles elaborated by Jefferson in the Declaration and by the framers in the Constitution. For Jackson and Douglas, it's simple majority rule. It's democracy 100% of the time. And if you want to enslave people in a particular state, go for it. If the majority wants that, that's fine. Lincoln found that absolutely abhorrent, and that's what sets him apart, I think, in a very critical way from Andrew Jackson. Now, let me just quickly add, JR. Lincoln is a man of the people. You know, he's fond of saying, of, by, and for the people. But again, there are certain principles that are not up for a majority vote.
Right. And Lincoln, of course, said public sentiment is everything. So how does his remark there correlate with his reverence for the rule of law?
Well, I think for Lincoln, in part, JR, Constitution and the Declaration were the Constitution, anyways, was ratified by the American people.
Yes.
The Articles of Confederation were ratified by the American people. So Lincoln believed our founding documents were, in a sense, ultimately rooted in the consent of the governed. So he's a firm believer in the consent of the governed. What he's not a firm believer in is that every issue, including some of the most pressing moral and legal issues like the expansion of slavery, those should not be up for a vote, because this regime does ultimately stand for something more than just popular vote. And again, it stands for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the American creed. That's what Lincoln is determined to protect, as his presidential oath requires him to do. So I admit there is a bit of part of the reason Stephen Douglas was such a formidable candidate, both in Illinois and nationwide, is that appeal of democracy, of letting the people decide. You know, it's a powerful message, and it resonates with people who are used to self-government. Lincoln's trying to walk that fine line by saying, yes, we're a system rooted in consent, but certain issues need to be off the table.
Absolutely. And I think it's truly remarkable too, Doctor, that within the preamble of the United States Constitution and with each of our state constitutions, it says that the people do ordain and establish this Constitution as the authority, not the majority rule, not what consensus says, but what the Constitution, the structure of the Constitution is what the authority is, not the president, not the representative, but the Constitution, correct?
That's a terrific point, JR, and I wish I had mentioned it prior to you having to bring it up, but that is, Lincoln was loved those words in the preamble, which of course were written by Gouverneur Morris at the Constitutional Convention. Absolutely terrific point.
Now, as we move forward, we come to Theodore Roosevelt, who revered Lincoln, but was very, very different in his ideas on the presidency than Lincoln was, wasn't he?
Absolutely. So what happens in the 20th century or at least the dawn of the 20th century, you have two presidents, one a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, the other a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. They weren't particularly close to one another on a personal level. In fact, there's quite a bit of resentment there, but they did share this progressive view that was percolating in the nation's colleges and in some media circles, that while the Constitution of 1787 was an admirable document, it was not particularly up to the job of governing a complicated country that had now industrialized. It was no longer an agrarian republic. It was something of a mixed economy in terms of its composition. That had changed things. Scientific advances, Darwinism, etc., had given us more insight into human nature and to perhaps the best way to structure a government. And of course, that Darwin occurs long after the framers. So this generation that comes to power in the early days of the 20th century believes it's time for a change. And they latch on to some aspects of Jeffersonianism. They also, interestingly enough, latch on to some elements of Hamiltonianism. And of course, the famous cliche of the progressive era is that we're going to use Hamiltonian means, an energetic government, to achieve Jeffersonian ends, a kind of egalitarianism. So to some extent, they see themselves as adopting bits and pieces from the founding era. But I would say, particularly with Woodrow Wilson, there is a kind of underlying contempt for the framers and for the Constitution. And I should add to this, JR, a kind of underlying contempt for the role that the Supreme Court is playing in American life in terms of implementing the rule of law. So in that sense, both TR and Wilson are contemptuous of what they see as a too rigid application of constitutional principles that are preventing us from truly entering into the 20th century.
And what's remarkable, Doctor, is that Woodrow Wilson said that the president can be as big a man as he can be. Yes. Really expanding the not looking at the enumerated duties of Article 2, thinking they're obsolete and archaic, but wanting to expand the role, very much like a prime minister of England, which he revered the parliamentary system of England.
He did. Excellent point, JR. And look, Wilson, at first, as you said, advocates for us shifting to a parliamentary system. It's more efficient. There's no checks and balances. We get things done quickly if we were to revert to a parliamentary system. But when he sees Teddy Roosevelt and some of the success that Roosevelt has in this new presidency that's going to use the bully pulpit, Wilson says, maybe we can make this system work as it is by making some significant adjustments in that the president, in a sense, will now become something of a Speaker of the House. The president is going to lead his party in Congress. And that's going to allow you to bridge the gap, bridge the separation of powers to get things done. Mm-hmm. And of course, Wilson's notion of the president being as big a man as he wants to be is also reflected in TR's notion of the stewardship theory. Mm-hmm. The TR stewardship theory was that the president can basically do anything that's not explicitly prohibited by the Constitution or by legislative statute. If it's not there, he can do it. And I do need to point out that TR, even in one instance, when Congress said you can't do X, went ahead and did it anyways. So you see this incredible expansion of executive power, and you also see them building on a tradition begun under Jefferson and Jackson of arguing that the actual selection of a president should be much more democratic, should not be done in the smoke-filled rooms by the party leaders.
Now, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected largely as a result of the Great Depression. And Doctor, explain how, or give an example of how FDR exponentially achieved Woodrow Wilson's view of the presidency.
Yeah, I think, it's important for your listeners to note that FDR served in Wilson's cabinet. He was an assistant secretary of the Navy. Now, that may not sound like a prominent position, but in fact it was, because the Navy Department at the time had cabinet rank. And Roosevelt basically ran that office through the First World War. So he was a prominent figure in Wilson's administration, and he learned from Wilson. But FDR can build on the Wilsonian conception of an unbounded presidency primarily through technological developments. And of course, I'm referring to radio. And FDR is going to use his fireside chats to develop a bond with the American public of the kind that Woodrow Wilson dreamed of. And now, radio, I think, was just barely coming into its own under Wilson, but during the Great Depression, most American families had radio. If you go to the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, you will see thousands and thousands of letters from people writing to the president after they listened to a fireside chat saying, "I felt you were in the room with me." Mm-hmm. It was like you and I are friends. And that is exactly the conception that Wilson hoped to implement. And I think FDR implements it on steroids, so to speak. I mean, when FDR dies after 12 plus years in the presidency, people felt they lost a friend.
And of course, FDR took the unprecedented route in extending his administration for 2 more terms, breaking the precedent set by our founding father, George Washington. But now, as we move forward, Doctor, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how JFK's agenda, which was largely fulfilled by LBJ, further, and this is the word you use in the book, degraded the founders' aspirations for the presidency.
Which part of the reason why I wrote my more recent book on JFK is I wanted to go back and take an even more extensive look at Kennedy. Look, Kennedy uses television the way FDR uses radio. So notice here, these technological changes are enhancing or expanding presidential power. And Kennedy, of course, was a master at using TV. I mean, if there was ever a man perfectly suited for the age, television was just coming into its own. This is a good-looking man, well-spoken. And, he's going to roll the dice and hold live press conferences, which President Eisenhower had never done. He had held press conferences, and he allowed the media to film them, but the White House would edit them and then release them to the public. Kennedy rolls the dice, cameras go on, and he's out there live. And his, at least, first series of press conferences are widely watched by the American public. It's estimated by the end of 1961 that 90 million people had watched one of President Kennedy's press conferences. So he is, again, he's taking the Wilsonian conception that it's important for the president to develop a charismatic, personal relationship with the public. Kennedy's using this technology, and it works like a charm. Now, look, as you pointed out, to some extent, it doesn't necessarily translate into successes in Congress. Lyndon Johnson will sort of use John F. Kennedy as a martyr to push Kennedy's agenda through. But I do think we'd be mistaken to dismiss Kennedy as a non-entity, because I think his use of television, his ability to, quote unquote, beat Richard Nixon in the first televised debate is a significant factor in his election in 1960. And again, it's going to be a significant factor throughout his entire presidency.
We'd love to have you back, Doctor, to talk about looking at John F. Kennedy in that recent book. I'm sure it's fascinating. But as we move forward, of course, you mentioned Ronald Reagan and his administration as the conservative Camelot, very similar to the image projected by Kennedy. And I've always said that Reagan was the lone exception in the New Deal era in which we live, that we actually had a president who said the federal government is not the answer to your problems. It's more local government initiated.
Yes. So certainly Ronald Reagan, in a sense, he was a child of the New Deal, and he had a deep admiration for Franklin Roosevelt and remembered Roosevelt's fireside chats quite fondly. But Reagan's policy prescriptions are not FDR by the time he becomes president. He is very much in the sort of Jeffersonian limited government, roll back, as you mentioned, the power of the federal government, give more authority back to the states. But I would say, JR, even though that's his prescription for the federal government writ large, that he wants to restrain it, at least domestically, not so much in the defense sphere. But in terms of his use of presidential power, in terms of his use of television, in terms of his use of radio, Reagan brings back the weekly radio address, remembering again the old speeches, the fireside chats of FDR. So Reagan is a kind of odd mix. He's accepting a number of the sort of Wilsonian principles related to presidential power. He's trying to use it in service of paring back the federal government. He doesn't have a lot of success at that, by the way. But there's no question that a lot of conservative supporters viewed Ronald Reagan as their John F. Kennedy, as their guy who knew how to use this new technology. And it was incredibly beneficial to him. I mean, the man wins 49 states in 1984. So, yeah.
Of course, we can't apply the terminology or the description of demagogue with Ronald Reagan, because he did try to unify his first inaugural, along with FDR's, probably the two most famous inaugurals of the 20th century. Reagan talked about us all being Americans. He tied in Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, and said we're all Americans. Then he talks about a Martin Treptow, who was a young man who was killed in World War I, to bring it down to the common man. So we cannot associate the present demagoguery or that we saw with the last Republican president with Ronald Reagan whatsoever.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And I argue in my book that, and by the way, Dwight Eisenhower played a similar unifying head of state role, but Ronald Reagan understood the importance of that role. You're absolutely right. And the kind of speeches we remember from Ronald Reagan are, in addition to his first inaugural, which you mentioned, his speech at the 40th anniversary of D-Day, incredibly powerful speech. His speech when the Challenger, the space shuttle, exploded. These are speeches where the President Reagan, tried to bring us together. And the other thing I would add, JR, that's extremely important, Ronald Reagan tended to avoid personal attacks on his opponents.
Right.
Whether it was Jimmy Carter in 1980 or Walter Mondale in 1984. This was a guy who, for the most part, I know your listeners can perhaps think of an occasional exception, but he refrained from attacking the other side. He certainly never accused the Democratic Party of being treasonous, of being un-American. And again, he understood the importance of that role of the president as a unifying head of state. And by the way, JR, that explains part of the reason why, in a poll taken this past summer, Ronald Reagan came in second with, I think, a 67 or 68 approval rate when the American public was asked to rank presidents from their past that they approved of.
I think it's significant, too, Doctor, that Ronald Reagan looked up to Calvin Coolidge in many ways, and Calvin Coolidge never, in all the different offices that he had earned or won through election, he never would say anything bad about the opponent. He would only talk about what he was going to do.
Excellent point, Joe.
And of course, we see that Reagan put Coolidge's picture up. Now, moving forward, now another man who put a picture up of a president who we've already talked about, Old Hickory, is a man by the name of Donald Trump. And in the book, the question I have for you, how is Trump the apotheosis of the popular presidency? And apotheosis means the pinnacle, the very top, the high mark.
Yes.
And how is Trump the apotheosis of the popular presidency?
Terrific question. Look, this is an important point. Donald Trump is still, he was able to become president in part due to the reforms, due to the new Wilsonian conception of the presidency, which argued that political parties should not play a big role in selecting a candidate. The people should. So Wilson, for instance, advocates for a national primary for both political parties. This is going to take time to evolve through the 20th and into the 21st century. But the fact is that Donald Trump was not the choice of Republican Party leaders in 2016, but it didn't matter because both parties have reformed their presidential selection process to give the rank and file members the ultimate say. And you almost had a situation in 2016 where the Democratic Party nominated Bernie Sanders. People forget he gave Hillary Clinton a heck of a run. And Bernie Sanders is not even a Democrat. He's a socialist, self-proclaimed. And Donald Trump's record did not indicate any particular links to the Republican Party before he is nominated. So you almost had two outsiders seizing control of both of these parties. Trump managed to do it, Sanders failed. But the Trump presidency, both in terms of winning the election and in terms of governing, and I would say Trump essentially governing through Twitter and through trying to dominate the 24/7 media cycle that we all live in. He was a master at it. And that is a consequence of these long-term trends of moving the presidency in a populist direction where appealing to public opinion becomes the be-all and end-all, where firing up the base becomes the be-all and end-all. And that unifying head of state role is completely lost in that populist presidency. Trump is the ultimate or the apotheosis of that trend.
Right. And of course, the characteristic of a demagogue is to pit one group against another. It's always us versus them. In this case, Trump talked about the establishment, and today, too many Republicans look at the establishment as the real enemy or the elite, going back to the Hamiltonian Jeffersonian rivalry. But what is important, and you bring this out in the book, is the importance of screening and how the leaders of the Republican Party failed to screen Trump and failed to filter out the demagoguery and really the autocracy and the lack of constitutional literacy that the man demonstrated. In the very beginning. It was the failure of the Republican Party leaders that enabled Trump to take over the party.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And look, within the Federalist Papers, which Hamilton and Madison and John Jay authored, there are, I believe, 66 specific references to either demagogues or demagoguery, and the link between a demagogue and the potential tyranny of the majority, which is the greatest tyranny of all. And we have put ourselves in a position where a demagogue, in my view, Trump was a demagogue, are knocking on the door of the White House. And I just find that to be a betrayal of the system that the founders hoped to create. I don't think it's at all healthy for a republic, but this is where we are. And again, the path leads back, in my view, primarily to Woodrow Wilson.
And another important aspect too, Doctor, that you bring up in the book is that another characteristic of demagoguery, of course, the idea not only that you're pitting one against another, but utilizing conspiracy theories. This goes back to Jefferson with Hamilton, with Jackson and the bank, and of course, Woodrow Wilson and the robber barons, FDR and Wall Street. It goes on and on and on. Whereas the constitutional-minded presidents, the ones that you don't hear about, that you make a great point out in the book, you don't hear this idea of conspiracy. And of course, now people are worried about the integrity of their elections, and it's all predicated on hyperbole.
Look, part of the one thing a demagogue always thinks or attempts to do is to banish rationality, banish reason from the public square, banish the use of your intellect, replace intellect with your emotions, sort of tweak your passions, tweak your hates. It can be incredibly successful. I think Andrew Jackson played that game. Certainly in my mind, Donald Trump played that game. Some of the other presidents you mentioned have played that game. It can reap benefits on election day. There's no doubt. But again, the consequences of that is to banish intellects from the public square and to divide the American people. And I mean, I never thought I would live this long to see people actually talking about the potential for civil war. I mean, we're not there yet, but we are so divided. And I'm old enough to remember 1968. I mean, we were very divided then. So I'm aware that we've had division in the past, but we're in a pretty bad place at the moment. And I attribute a lot of that to some of the events of the very recent past.
Of course, you talk about in the final chapter, Doctor, about the prospects for renewal. And in my estimation, your book is a great step in the direction towards renewal. And that is renewing the idea of the constitutional presidency, constitutional government, rather than presidential governance led by a particular man. And those who support Trump and those who call themselves Republicans, they're not looking to the principles of the Constitution. The Tea Party was really a facilitator of Trump, and they really weren't serious about the Constitution. In many ways, they were a reaction against George W. Bush's and Obama's presidencies, and wanted to get back to the Constitution, but they threw all that out in their support of Donald Trump, who has no regard for constitutionalism whatsoever. But your book explains all this. And incidentally, just let me say, Doctor, for our audience, that you go through each one of the administrations. For the sake of time, I didn't touch on each one of the chapters, but you go through each one of the administrations. And I think it's very important, and I'd love for you to just talk about this a minute, that somebody like a Rutherford B. Hayes or a Benjamin Harrison is much more in line with what the founders intended than what we have here today with Donald Trump and the demagoguery associated with him.
Yeah, I know. I do make the case that a lot of so-called failed presidents or presidents who are described as mediocrities were not necessarily the case. Now, some of the reasons they were labeled that, Benjamin Harrison is a great example. A number of progressives didn't like him because he tended to be pro-free enterprise. He was not an advocate of economic regulation. But on civil rights matters, he actually had a very impressive record. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's happened is a lot of those Gilded Age presidents were and still are criticized by folks who are kind of caught up in the whole lost cause of the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. Those Gilded Age presidents tend to be ex-Union officers. They hated Ulysses S. Grant, for instance, but Hayes and Harrison and the others had served as well. And they were just given a raw deal in the history books because of their perceived hostility to the South. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to convince my fellow scholars that maybe it's time to apply a new matrix or new set of metrics in terms of how we judge great American presidents. Mm-hmm. And I make an attempt to, elevate John Quincy Adams, William Howard Taft, Dwight Eisenhower, and even Benjamin Harrison as somebody who deserves a second or third look, because I do think for most of the 20th century and into this century, the historical and political science profession has tended to be dominated by progressives who have a certain contempt for those presidents who abided by the Constitution, who didn't stir the partisan pot, who didn't see themselves as kind of radical change agents. I think a Taft deserves a second look. I would, if I had my way, I'd probably put Taft up on Mount Rushmore. I'm not sure he would fit, but that's where I am. That was a cheap shot. I shouldn't have said that.
No, that's very appropriate. And of course, Taft was a great constitutionalist and was a chief justice after he was president of the United States. Truly remarkable. And he was he was the bridge between TR and Woodrow Wilson. And also, you make great points in the book about Ulysses S. Grant, his desire to his great desires on human rights and stopping the Ku Klux Klan. And one of the aspects that you bring out in the book is referring to these Republican presidents who've been forgotten because they were more constitutionally minded than they were popular minded. But the Republican Party of today, they're calling people rhinos who really they're the rhinos who are calling others rhinos, because the real Republicans, Doctor, go back to Lincoln, go back to men like Thaddeus Stevens, like Charles Sumner, Grant, and even Rutherford Hayes believed that educating the people in the South was what was really important. He wasn't able to get that done, but all of these men really revered the Constitution in a much greater way than what popular central government would adhere to.
No question. No question.
But I want to thank you, Doctor. We went a little bit over, but we could talk forever. And I want to. The link there is provided for people to purchase the book, and also the link for Dr. Knott's website, which is very, very informative and great information on that. And Doctor, we hope you'll come back to talk about Alexander Hamilton, because like the lost cause in the Civil War, there's also been a lot of bad information about Alexander Hamilton, and you've taught me a lot about how great that man truly was. And your book, Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth, I hope we can talk about next time.
That'd be great. Yeah, no, I've been a big fan of Hamilton even before he became a Broadway celebrity. So
and
I was riding that wave long before it was popular.
And I heard you said that I heard you say you really enjoyed the show as well.
Yeah, my wife and I have seen it 3 times. We loved it. Lin-Manuel Miranda took some liberties with it, which, being a Hamilton scholar, I immediately noticed, but I'm not going to, on the whole, it was great entertainment. Perhaps more importantly, JR, one thing I noticed after that musical came out is a lot of young people, really young people, kind of, it sparked a bit of an interest in the founding, certainly in Hamilton himself, and one can only see that as a positive development. So,
well, the book is The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery and the Prospects for Renewal. And you're going to want to get this book and read it. It's outstanding. And it is one of the steps that needs to be taken for the people to renew constitutional Republican government. That's small R. We take it to the big R as well for the American people. Dr. Knott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, JR. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and keep up the good work.
We'll do it, and you helping us do that work will assure our success. Thank you very much.
Great. You bet. Take care now.